The laughter started before she even reached the firing line. Lina Harrow walked onto the Cape Lark range with a faded range bag and an oversized jacket, and every SEAL on the line took one look at her 5'4", 18 years old, and decided the morning had just gotten entertaining. Someone made a comment. Someone else laughed. Brock Sutter didn't bother hiding his grin. Then she shot. 3 steel targets at distance, 3 consecutive hits, wind blowing hard off the water. The grinning stopped. If you like stories about people who prove everyone wrong the hard way, stick around and subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from. Cape Lark Naval Training Annex sat on a narrow strip of coastline where the Atlantic had spent centuries trying to reclaim the land and hadn't quite succeeded. The buildings were low and salt-worn, the asphalt cracked in long diagonal lines from years of freeze and thaw, and the range itself stretched out toward the water in a way that guaranteed the wind would never cooperate. Instructors who'd trained at other facilities called Cape Lark miserable. The ones who'd trained there longest called it honest. It was the kind of place that didn't care about your record. It only cared about what you could do when the gust shifted at the wrong moment and your spotter was already calling the next target. The SEAL team arrived at 700 in 2 vehicles, 7 men moving with the easy authority of people who had never once questioned whether they belonged somewhere. Chief Dorian Keats stepped out first, broad-shouldered, close-cropped hair going gray at the temples, a face that looked like it had been carved specifically to express skepticism. He ran his eyes across the range in a single sweep, the way a man checks a room before he walks into it. Then nodded once and said nothing. Brock Sutter climbed out behind him, already scanning the boards for the day's schedule. Brock was the team's best shooter, and he knew it the way a hammer knows it's a hammer, completely without apology. He'd posted the top score at Cape Lark twice in the past 3 years. He considered the range his in the way athletes consider a stadium theirs. Not ownership exactly, but familiarity so deep it functioned the same way. The rest of the team filtered in, checked their gear, made the small jokes men make when they're comfortable, and expecting an ordinary day. It was Cade Rillen who noticed her first. Cade was the facility's senior electronics technician, responsible for the automated target system that tracked hits, logged scores, and fed data to the evaluation software. He was a thin man in his mid-30s, with careful eyes and the habit of standing slightly apart from whatever group he was near, as though proximity to other people required deliberate management. He'd been at Cape Lark for 6 years. In those 6 years, he had never once flagged an anomaly on the scoring system, not formally, not in writing. He answered questions before they were fully asked. He filed maintenance holds on Range 7 with quiet regularity, none of which produced documented repairs. None of that was visible as anything other than diligence if you weren't looking for the pattern. When Lina Harrow checked in at the range desk, Cade was running a diagnostic on the scoring panel 12 feet away. He glanced up when the clerk read her name aloud, standard procedure confirming the visitor log, and something shifted in his face. Not dramatically, just a tightening around the eyes, a half-second pause before he looked back at his screen. Anyone not paying attention would have missed it. Chief Keats was paying attention. He filed it away without reacting and went back to his pre-assessment walkthrough. Lina crossed the staging area with her range bag over one shoulder, her expression the particular kind of neutral that isn't really neutral at all. It's the face of someone who is prepared for exactly this, who has walked this moment forward in their mind enough times that the actual version of it can't surprise them anymore. She was small. That was the first thing people registered, because it was hard not to. She stood maybe 5'4", slight build, dark hair pulled back tight. She looked younger than 18, which she was not. She looked like she'd wandered in from the wrong building, which she had not. Commander Maria Sloan met her near the equipment lockers. Sloan was the range's senior oversight officer, mid-40s, efficient, the kind of woman who solved problems before they became incidents. She had authorized Lina's participation in the day's expanded evaluation under a junior observer designation, which meant Lina was technically present but had no assigned lane and no scheduled assessment slot. "You're on observation status," Sloan told her. "You can move to active participation if a team member clears a slot for you." Lina nodded. "Understood." She'd known before she arrived that no one was going to clear a slot for her. That wasn't why she'd come with a plan that started with observation. She set her bag down on a bench at the far end of the staging area, unzipped it, and began checking her rifle with the methodical focus of someone for whom this was not performance. She'd grown up in a house where her father came home from work and spread schematics across the kitchen table the way other fathers spread newspapers. She'd learned to read wind charts before she could drive. She'd spent 3 years on a private range outside Raleigh, shooting alone in the early morning hours, working through drills her father had designed and never gotten to see her complete. Lina Harrow had been dead for 14 months. He'd been a systems engineer, specifically the engineer who had designed the first generation of Cape Lark's automated target system. 3 years ago, during a live fire evaluation, a targeting malfunction had caused a near-miss incident serious enough to trigger a full investigation. The inquiry concluded that the malfunction resulted from a design flaw. Oren's design. Oren's flaw. Except it wasn't. Lina had read every page of the investigation report. She'd read her father's private notebooks, the ones he'd kept in a locked drawer that she'd opened only after the funeral. She'd read the warnings he'd submitted formal, documented, submitted through proper channels about a signal drift error in Range 7's control hardware, warnings that were logged, acknowledged, and ignored. She had not come to Cape Lark to make friends. She had come because 3 weeks ago, she'd found out that the targeting system currently running at Cape Lark was a direct iteration of her father's original design. And because the man responsible for maintaining it, Cade Rillen, had been present during the original investigation and had never in 6 years flagged a single anomaly in writing. Cade finished his diagnostic, closed his panel case, and walked past her bench without looking at her. Lina watched him go. The morning's first assessment block began at 800. 7 SEAL shooters, 2 range officers, 1 scoring technician, and 1 girl sitting on a bench at the far end of the staging area with nothing to do but watch. Lina watched carefully. She watched the way Brock Sutter set up efficient, practiced the kind of shooter who'd done this so many times that preparation had collapsed into reflex. She watched the way Chief Keats positioned himself slightly behind and to the left of whatever was happening, always at an angle that let him see the whole picture. She watched Cade Rillen move between the scoring terminal and the target control panel, his hands busy, his eyes occasionally flicking toward the bench where she sat. She also watched the wind. There was a thin piece of parachute cord tied to the zipper pull of her range bag, 2 inches long, light enough to respond to the smallest shift in airflow. She'd made it herself, same design her father had used on his own bag, because he'd told her once that the most expensive wind meter you could buy was still slower than a piece of string you'd been watching for 10 minutes. By 8:30, she had the morning's wind pattern mapped in her head. The gusts came in off the water in irregular intervals, averaging 12 seconds between shifts, with a consistent left-to-right drift that spiked briefly when the air moved through the gap between the 2 range structures to the north. It wasn't complicated once you understood it. It just required patience. Brock Sutter finished a near-perfect run on the standard assessment course and was walking back to the staging area when he saw Lina looking at her piece of cord instead of his scorecard. "Something funny?" he said. "No," Lina said. He stopped. He looked at her bag, her rifle, her face. "You waiting for someone to invite you?" "I was told I need a team member to clear a slot." Brock glanced back at his teammates, then at her, and the grin came back, not mean exactly, but the specific grin of a man who is about to say something he thinks is generous and amusing at the same time. "All right, you want a slot?" He pointed toward the far steel targets, 3 of them stationed at distances that made the wind problem significantly worse. "Hit all 3 of those consecutive, and I'll put you in my lane for the afternoon block." A couple of the team members looked up. One of them made a quiet sound that wasn't quite a laugh, but was headed there. Lina stood up. She didn't rush. She took her rifle from the bench, ran a single press check, and walked to the firing line without asking anyone to move. She stood at the position, looked downrange for a moment, and then looked at her cord. She waited 4 seconds. Then she raised the rifle, settled into her stance, and fired. The first target dropped. She waded through a gust, tracked the cord's movement, fired again. The second target dropped. One more pause. The wind shifted through the northern gap. She'd been waiting for it, and she fired into the shift's tail end. The third target dropped. The staging area was quiet, in the way a room goes quiet when something happens that nobody had actually believed would happen. Not the quiet of respect, not yet. The quiet of recalibration, of people updating their assessment of a situation they thought they'd already assessed. Brock's grin was gone. Not replaced by anything hostile, just gone, the way an expression disappears when the face beneath it needs a moment to decide what comes next. Chief Keats didn't look at Lina. He looked at Cade Rillen. Cade was already moving toward the target control panel. "Could be a sensor calibration issue with the steel," he said to no one in particular, in the tone of someone offering information rather than deflection. "Heat expansion this time of morning sometimes throws the reset mechanism." "Check it," Keats said. "Already on it." Lina lowered her rifle and waited. Commander Sloan had watched the whole thing from the range office doorway. She stepped out, now made a decision in the space of about 4 seconds, and walked toward the center of the staging area. "Change of plan," she said. "Miss Harrow will participate in the full afternoon assessment block, alongside the team. Scoring will be integrated." She looked at Keats. "Any objections?" Keats said nothing, which with him meant no. Brock picked up his water bottle, took a long drink, and didn't look at Lina. But he didn't object either. Cade Rillen crouched at the target panel with his back to the room, went very still for just a moment before he resumed his work. Sloan gave the team 20 minutes before the afternoon block started. Most of them used it to hydrate, check gear, run through their notes from the morning. Brock sat on the tailgate of one of the vehicles and stared at the range without appearing to see it. Lina stood near her bench and did not move toward anyone. She understood what was about to happen. Not the specifics, she couldn't know those, but the shape of it. She'd grown up watching her father navigate rooms where he was the most technically capable person present, and also the least welcome. And she'd learned early that capability without invitation creates a specific kind of friction. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that works through process and procedure and small bureaucratic decisions that individually mean nothing and collectively mean everything. She had not expected to be handed a lane and wished good luck. What she hadn't fully calculated was how exposed she would become once she stepped into that lane. Observation status had given her a position outside the structure, inconvenient, easy to dismiss, but also invisible in a useful way. The moment Commander Sloan folded her into the official assessment, Lina stopped being an oddity on a bench and became a variable inside a system. Someone else's system. With someone else's rules. She picked up her rifle and ran the same pre-shoot check she'd done 100 times. Hands moving through the sequence without requiring instruction from her brain. Her father had drilled it into her. When everything else is uncertain, the mechanical check is certain. Start there. Keats walked over. He didn't sit down or lean against anything. He stood the way he always stood, square, weight-balanced, nothing casual about it. "You've been here before," he said. It wasn't a question. "No, you know this range." Lina looked at him. "I know the design." Keats waited. "My father built the first version of the target system here," she said. "I grew up reading his schematics. I know where the windbreaks are because he documented them. I know where the sensor gaps are because he flagged them." She paused. Nobody listened to that part. Keats held her gaze for a long moment. "Orrin Harrow." Yes, he said nothing after that. He didn't apologize, didn't offer any expression she could read as sympathy or acknowledgement. He just nodded once and walked back toward the team. Across the staging area, Cade Rillon had heard every word. He was standing at the scoring terminal with a tablet in his hand, and he wasn't logging anything. He was listening. Then he set the tablet down and walked toward the equipment room with the careful pace of someone who does not want to appear to be in a hurry. Lina noticed. She filed it away. The afternoon block began at 1300. Lina was assigned to lane 4, between two of the team's quieter members, with Brock 2 lanes to her left. The assessment coordinator read the format aloud. 3 sequential skill blocks scores, aggregated rankings, posted at the end of each block. Walsh, one of the team's steadier shooters, gave her a brief nod when she took her position. It wasn't warmth. It was the acknowledgement one competitor gives another when they've accepted that the competition is real. She accepted it the same way. She stepped into lane 4, set her bag down, and looked downrange at the first target array. Then, she looked at her cord. The wind was coming in steady off the water. 12-second intervals, left to right drift through the northern gap. Same as this morning. Same as it had been all day. She was ready. The first skill block was close-range reflexive shooting. Targets appeared in random sequence at distances between 15 and 50 meters, some stationary, some moving on lateral tracks, all requiring fast acquisition and clean hits within a tight time window. It was designed to reward speed, aggression, and the kind of muscle memory that only came from years of high-volume training. It was, by any reasonable measure, Brock Sutter's ideal conditions. He went third in the rotation and was brilliant. Fast transitions, no wasted movement, a fluency with the rifle that made the whole sequence look less like a test and more like a demonstration. When he finished and walked back to the staging area, 2 of his teammates raised their chins at him, and he accepted it without acknowledgement, which was its own kind of acknowledgement. Walsh had a strong run. Keats, who shot with a controlled precision that prioritized accuracy over speed, posted a number that was high without being flashy. The scores held near the top of the range through the next 4 shooters. Lina went last. The staging area had the quality of attention that pretends not to be attention. People not quite looking at her, conversations that had tapered off without anyone deciding to stop them. She walked to lane 4, set her feet, and waited for the signal. The buzzer sounded. She didn't accelerate to match the pace the previous shooters had set. She found her own pace, which was slower in the spaces between targets and faster in the moment of acquisition. A rhythm that looked almost unhurried from the outside, but produced a hit rate that didn't drop. No double taps on easy targets to compensate for missed ones. No rushed transitions that pulled her muzzle off the next acquisition point. She moved through the course the way her father had described good engineering. Nothing extra, nothing missing. When the final target dropped and the clock stopped, the scoring board updated. Lina had outscored 3 members of the team. She was sitting 4th overall behind Brock Keats and Walsh. The staging area processed this in silence. Then Brock said, "System's throwing bad reads again." He said it to no one specifically, in the tone of a man thinking out loud rather than making an accusation. 3rd time this month the close-range sensors have miscounted. Cade was at the scoring terminal before the sentence was finished. "Could be heat interference," he said. "The close-range sensor array runs warmer than the others, and today's ambient temperature—" "Pull the raw data," Keats said. "Already checking." Cade's hands moved across the terminal. "Some of these hit registrations look marginal. Could be edge strikes getting counted as center." Lina said nothing. She was looking at the terminal from 20 feet away, and she was noticing something this conversation had started the moment her score appeared. Not before. Not when the previous 4 shooters posted their numbers. The moment hers did. The second skill block was moving target engagement in variable wind. Targets tracked across the range on irregular courses, changing speed and direction without warning, and the wind off the water, made every calculation provisional. It was the kind of block that separated shooters who understood ballistics from shooters who had good reflexes, because reflexes alone weren't enough when the target's next position depended on factors you had to read rather than react to. This was closer to what Lina had grown up doing. She watched Brock's run first. He was excellent, better than most people would ever be. But she could see the half-second where he was reacting instead of predicting, the fractional delay between the target's direction change and his muzzle movement. He finished with a strong score. He walked back with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has done what he came to do. Then Lina shot. She wasn't faster than Brock. She was earlier. There's a difference. She was already moving to where the target was going to be before it started going there. The cord at her bag having given her the wind's rhythm hours ago. Her eyes having tracked the target's mechanical pattern through the previous shooter's runs. When the target changed direction, her muzzle was already waiting. When her score posted, Brock was quiet for a long moment. During the break between blocks, he watched her clean her rifle, without being asked to, and without looking up at anyone. He watched the way her hands moved, no wasted motion, the same economy she brought to everything else. And he thought about the wind call she'd made on those 3 steel targets that morning, the way she'd waited for a specific moment in the gust pattern, rather than just shooting between gusts the way everyone else did. He'd been shooting for 12 years. He knew what that kind of read required. It wasn't luck. It wasn't instinct. It was knowledge, specific, accumulated, hard-earned knowledge. And it came from somewhere. He didn't say anything yet, but when he turned back to his gear, he moved a little more slowly than usual. The third block was long-range precision, single targets at extended distances, no movement, just wind distance and whatever the shooter brought with them. Lina outscored Brock by 4 points. When the number appeared on the board, the range went quiet the way a room goes quiet when something is shifted, and everyone present knows it, even if no one wants to say it out loud. Chief Keats stepped forward. Harrow. His voice was level. You want to explain to me how an 18-year-old civilian is reading this range better than men who've been training here for 3 years? It wasn't hostile. It was the question of a man who needed an honest answer and was asking for one directly. My father designed the first generation of this target system, Lina said. He spent 2 years mapping every variable on this range. Wind patterns, sensor placement, structural interference points. He kept detailed records. She paused. I read all of them. Orrin Harrow, Keats said. Yes. He flagged a malfunction before the Range 7 incident. He flagged it 4 times. The last report was submitted 11 days before the accident. She kept her voice flat. It was logged and not acted on. The staging area was very still. Cade Rillan turned around from the scoring terminal. Orrin Harrow's reports were reviewed during the investigation, he said. His voice was controlled. The board concluded the malfunction was a design error, not a maintenance oversight. Coming here and shooting well doesn't change what the investigation found. He answered before anyone had directed the question at him. He cut Lina off before she finished her sentence. His voice was steady, but his hands, Brock noticed, had stopped moving entirely. Brock looked at Cade for a moment. Then he looked back at the range and said nothing. No, Lina said. But it might change what people are willing to look at. The 4th assessment block began 20 minutes later. The atmosphere on the range had changed in the way weather changes, not with a single dramatic shift, but through an accumulation of small pressures that eventually produce something you can't ignore. Lina stepped into lane 4 and raised her rifle. The first target appeared. She fired. Clean hit. The second target appeared. She fired. The scoring board didn't register it. She lowered her rifle slightly, looked at the board, looked back down range at the target. The hit indicator on the steel was visible, a fresh mark left of center, well within the scoring zone. The board showed nothing. She fired at the third target. The board registered that one. Then the fourth appeared, and she hit it. And the board went blank again. She completed the block and walked back to the staging area. Her score for the block was less than half of what it should have been. Walsh looked at the board and frowned. "That's not right." "Sensor drift," Cade said, already moving. "I flagged this array for recalibration last week. Probably got worse with the heat." He pulled up the diagnostic screen on his tablet. "I can run a correction cycle between blocks. Should normalize the—" "I want manual scoring," Lina said. Cade stopped. "Manual scoring isn't in the assessment protocol." "Then I want the block voided and rerun on a different array." "That's not how evaluations work here." "She can request a verification run," Keats said. "Chief, the protocol. The protocol also says scores need to be defensible. If the array is malfunctioning, the scores aren't defensible." Keats's voice was the same level it always was, which somehow made it more final. "Pull the raw strike data and let's see what the sensors actually captured versus what they logged." Cade's jaw tightened. Then he nodded and turned back to his terminal. Commander Sloan had stepped out of the range office. She stood at the edge of the staging area and watched. The raw data came up on the main board. 7 strikes logged by the sensors. 14 strikes visible on the target face when the range officer walked down range and examined it with a spotting scope. "Equipment failure," Cade said. "It happens. The correction cycle will." "Run the block again," Sloan said. "Manual spotting. Range officer calls the hits." Lina ran the block clean. The range officer called every hit. When the score was posted manually, she was sitting second overall, behind only Brock. Nobody said anything about sensor drift, but 30 minutes later, Cade walked over to Commander Sloan with his tablet and spoke to her quietly. Sloan's expression shifted. She held up a hand toward the range officer, stopping the setup, and walked with Cade to the range office. They were inside for 4 minutes. When Sloan came back out, her face carried the careful neutrality of someone who has just been handed a problem they hadn't anticipated. "Assessment is on hold," she said. "We have a flag on the evaluation integrity." She looked at Lina. "Miss Harrow, Mr. Rillen's diagnostic has identified a connection log showing a device registered to you interfaced with the target system's scoring network during the 3rd and 4th blocks." The staging area went very still. Lina felt it land somewhere behind her sternum. She looked at Sloan. "That's not possible. The log shows a MAC address registered to a tablet in your equipment bag." "I don't have a tablet in my bag." Mr. Rillen's system flagged the connection. Lina looked at Cade. He was standing at the edge of the group with his tablet held at his side, and his face was the face of a man performing composure, rather than feeling it. "She's been running a side interface the whole time," Brock said. His voice was hard. "That's why the scores looked wrong." Lina opened her mouth, then she stopped, because for 3 full seconds she didn't speak, and it wasn't because she had nothing to say. It was because a quieter, more frightening thought had moved through her first. What if there's something in that bag I don't know about? What if someone put something there and I carried it in without knowing, and every score I've posted today is going to be reviewed under that assumption? She stood with that thought. Then she let it go. Not because it wasn't frightening, it was, but because it was the thought they wanted her to have. The thought that made her doubt herself instead of doubting them. Her father had spent 2 years doubting himself after the investigation, turning his own certainty over and over, looking for the flaw in it. And that self-doubt had cost him more than the accusation had. She was not going to do that. "Open the bag," she said. Sloan nodded to the range officer, who crossed to Lina's bench and unzipped the bag methodically. He removed each item and placed it on the bench. Rifle cleaning kit, spare magazines, water bottle, her father's old logbook, the piece of parachute cord she'd cut from the zipper pull. No tablet. Brock stared at the bench. Then he looked at Cade. "If there's no tablet," he said slowly, "then where did that connection log come from?" Cade said nothing. "A MAC address in a connection log can be spoofed," Lina said. "You can register a fake device identifier on a network and make the log show whatever interface you want it to show." She looked at Cade. "My father documented that exact technique in his investigation notes. He found evidence it had been used to create false calibration records before the Range 7 incident. He reported it. Nobody looked at it." The room was very quiet. Cade didn't answer, but something in his posture had changed. The careful stillness that had sustained him all day was starting to cost him visibly. Commander Sloan raised her hand. "Assessment is suspended. Miss Harrow, you're on hold pending review." She looked at Cade. "Don't touch the scoring system until I say so." Lina turned back to her bench and began replacing items in her bag. As she reached for her father's logbook, she caught the edge of the main scoring display out of the corner of her eye. A system error code sat in the bottom corner of the screen. 6 characters, blinking amber. She had seen that code before. Not here. In her father's notebook, on the last page he'd written before he got too sick to write anymore. He had circled it twice and written 3 words next to it in the margin. "Not my fault." She set the logbook down carefully and looked at the code. It wasn't a standard system error. It was a flag, a specific flag that her father had documented as the signature output of the secondary router device he'd found evidence of before the investigation. The device that could manufacture false calibration data. The device that someone had used to destroy him. The system running at Cape Lark right now wasn't just built on her father's design. Someone had preserved the exploit, kept it functional, kept it available. Because a tool that could manufacture evidence of a design flaw was too useful to delete. She zipped her bag. She had one more move to make. She found Chief Keats outside the range office, standing in the narrow strip of shade along the building's east wall. He was looking at the water. "I need to get into Range 7, she said. "Assessment is suspended. You're on hold." "I know what the error code on that board means. My father documented it. There's a secondary signal router somewhere in Range 7's control hardware, a physical device that can manipulate the scoring network from outside the main system. That's what was used against him 3 years ago, and that's what's being used now." She paused. "If it's still there, it proves the malfunction was never a design flaw. It was deliberate interference." Keats was quiet. "Range 7 is locked. Maintenance hold." Cade Rillen filed that hold 2 days ago. He's filed 4 maintenance holds on Range 7 in the past 18 months. None of them resulted in documented repairs. I pulled the facility log when I checked in this morning. Keats turned and looked at her. She looked back at him steadily. He pushed off the wall. "Stay behind me." They were halfway across the range when Brock fell into step beside them. Keats glanced at him. Brock said nothing. Keats looked forward and kept walking. Walsh, who had been watching from the staging area, followed a few steps behind without being asked. Cade came out of the equipment room and saw them heading toward Range 7's access gate. He moved to intercept, and the speed of it, the immediacy, the absence of any pretense, told Keats everything before a word was spoken. "That section is under maintenance lock," Cade said. "Nobody goes in there without facility authorization." "I am facility authorization," Keats said and kept walking. "Chief," Cade's voice shifted. "There are liability issues with unauthorized access to a locked range section." "Then I'll write the incident report myself." Keats reached the gate, entered his access code, and pushed it open. "Stay here." Range 7 was older than the rest of the facility, the original construction, from the era when the annex was first built. The target frames were mechanical rather than electronic. The control, housing a gray metal box mounted on a post near the firing line, weathered and salt-pitted, and secured with a padlock that looked newer than everything around it. Lina crouched at the base of the control post and examined the housing's lower panel. The screws were slightly stripped, not from age, but from being removed and replaced repeatedly. She pointed at them without touching anything. Keats produced a multi-tool from his belt and handed it to her. She removed the panel. Inside the housing, behind the main relay board, a secondary device was mounted on a bracket that hadn't come with the original installation. It was small, about the size of a deck of cards, with 2 short antenna leads and a series of indicator lights, all currently dark. It had been there long enough to accumulate dust on its upper surface and salt corrosion on its mounting screws, but the connection ports were clean, recently used. Brock crouched beside her and looked at it. "That's not factory." "No," Lina said. "My father described it in his notes. He found evidence of one like it before the Range 7 incident. He photographed it and included the photo in his final report." She looked at Keats. The report that was dismissed. Keats stood up and took out his phone. Commander Sloan arrived at Range 7 4 minutes later. She stood at the control housing and looked at the device for a long time without speaking. Then she looked at Cade Rillen, who had followed at a distance and was now standing outside the gate with the specific stillness of a man who has run out of moves. "Don't go anywhere," Sloan said to him. She called it in herself, directly to the base commander's office. She was on the phone for 6 minutes. When she hung up, she looked at Keats. "Full stop on today's evaluation. Internal review team is dispatched. Rillen is to be detained pending interview." She looked at Lina. "I owe you an apology." "I don't need one," Lina said. "I need the investigation into my father's case reopened." Sloan nodded once. "That's above my authority to authorize directly. But what we found today will be part of the record." Cade, when formally interviewed an hour later, with 2 officers present, did not deny knowing about the device. He said he hadn't installed it, that it had been there when he arrived at Cape Lark 6 years ago, left by the contractor who'd managed the original system upgrade. He said he'd been instructed by his supervisor at the time to leave it in place and not document it. He said when the Range 7 incident happened and the investigation pointed at Lina Harrow, he'd understood what the device was for and what it had been used for, and he'd said nothing. One of the officers asked him why. Cade looked at the table for a long moment. Then he said he'd been told that coming forward would end his career and possibly his freedom, that Oren was already the designated explanation and the investigation was already closed, and nothing, he said, would bring the man back. He said Oren had come to him privately 3 weeks before the investigation concluded, had told him he knew about the device, had asked Cade to corroborate his report. Cade had said no. He said it quietly, looking at the table. He didn't add anything to it. There was nothing to add. Commander Sloan set up the final assessment in the late afternoon, an hour before the lights started to go. She used Range 7. The target frames were mechanical, the scoring done by 2 range officers with spotting scopes and paper logs. No electronics anywhere in the process. She posted the format on the staging area board and told the team it was voluntary. All 7 of them showed up. Walsh was the first one there. Brock went first. He shot the way he always shot, with total commitment, every round placed with the focused intensity of someone who takes the activity seriously as a matter of identity. His score was the highest he'd posted all day. He walked back to the staging area and stood with his arms crossed and watched the range. Lina was last. Before she stepped into the lane, Brock moved up beside her. He didn't look at her directly. He looked downrange. "Winds shifted," he said. "Coming more from the northeast now. Gap between the structures is going to push it left instead of right." She looked at her cord. He was correct. "Thanks," she said. "Don't thank me," he said, and stepped back. She walked to the line. She removed her right ear pro and held it at her side. The wind moved through the range with a low, uneven sound, and she listened to it change pitch when it hit the target frames, the way her father had taught her. Not with instruments, but with attention. The kind of attention that required you to be quiet enough inside to hear something that wasn't trying to be loud. She raised the rifle.
Close targets first.
She moved through them without hurry, each shot placed in the half-second window between gusts. Then the mid-range array. She waited on the third one, felt the northeast shift come through the gap, and fired into the tail of it. Then the far targets, single shots, the ones where the wind had enough distance to work with. And a quarter inch of error at the muzzle became several inches at the steel. Every target dropped. When the range officers tallied the paper logs and posted the final numbers, Lina's score was the highest of the day. Not by a small margin. The staging area was quiet. Keats walked over. He reached into his breast pocket and removed a small metal pin. The Cape Lark Marksmanship Instructor Badge. Issued to personnel certified to run the range's advanced assessment program. He set it on the bench in front of her. "You don't need anyone's permission to be here," he said. "Not anymore." Lina looked at the pin for a moment. Then she picked it up and held it in her palm. The sun was low by the time the staging area cleared out. The team filtered back to their vehicles in ones and twos, the day's wait settling into the particular quiet that follows something that changed the shape of what people expected. Lina sat on the old wooden steps at the edge of the range and cleaned her rifle. Her father's rifle. The one he'd built himself from components over 3 years, working at the kitchen table in the evenings, explaining each part to her as he went. She ran the cleaning rod through the barrel and listened to the water. She heard boots on the gravel and looked up. Brock was standing a few feet away, holding a sheet of paper. He held it out. She took it. It was one of the paper scoring targets from the final block. The far target, where the wind had been worst. Her shot was centered in the scoring ring, with a precision that the range officer had noted in the margin, with a single word: exceptional. "Where'd you learn to read wind like that?" Brock asked. She looked at the target for a moment, then she looked up at him. "From someone you didn't listen to," she said. Brock held her gaze, then he nodded once and walked back to his vehicle. Chief Keats stopped beside her on his way out. "Program director will be in contact," he said. "Advanced marksmanship instruction track. Starts in 6 weeks." He looked at her. "It's not a favor. You understand that." "I understand," she said. He walked on. Lina sat alone on the steps as the last of the light went orange and flat across the water. She finished cleaning the rifle, reassembled it in the order her father had shown her, and placed it back in the faded range bag. She picked up the scoring target Brock had given her and looked at it one more time. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the front pocket of her father's logbook, next to the last page he'd written. The page that ended with 3 words. "Not my fault." She zipped the bag, stood up, and walked off the range. Behind her on the staging area board, the final scores were still posted. At the top of the list, in the range officer's handwriting, nobody handed Lina Harrow a seat at that table. Nobody vouched for her. Nobody smoothed the way. She walked in carrying nothing but what her father had given her. Not connections, not credentials, not a name that opened doors. Just knowledge, earned in solitude, in the early mornings on a range where no one was watching. And she let the work speak. There's something in that worth holding on to. The idea that the most durable thing you can carry into a room where no one believes in you is the kind of preparation that doesn't require anyone's permission to be real. Lina didn't win because she was louder or more aggressive or more impressive on paper. She won because she had done the quiet work long before anyone was paying attention. Her father did that work too. He just never got to see it matter. Maybe that's the hardest part of this story, that some people do everything right and the world still gets it wrong, at least for a while. But Lina understood something her father hadn't had time to fully act on. The truth doesn't expire. It just waits for someone willing to walk it back into the room. If that kind of story stays with you, the ones about people who kept going when the system said stop, then subscribe. There are more of them here. Every single one is worth your time.